well,
all good to go.
Most of Tolkien's works were published posthumously in different versions. Many of his stories are verse narratives, such as those published in the History of Middle-earth, especially in The Lays of Beleriand. Early and late poetic and prosaic versions are interconnected in numerous ways, and they have to be considered by a translator, as well as the editorial notes and explanations, such as those made by Christopher Tolkien. For the translation of such editions, the usual way to translate a poem by creating its new version in another language, having the poetic merits of the original while changing words and word order, is hardly suitable. Russian translators of different volumes of the History of Middle-earth, I will show them. Well, and the Great Tales used a variety of approaches to present Tolkien's poems, from poetic translation of verses while omitting some versions and notes to prosaic translation of the quotations in the commentary. In my talk, I will discuss these approaches. The Lays of Beleriand has been translated only into 4 languages, since balancing the beauty of the language and the factual accuracies is needed an extremely hard task to tackle. Therefore, this analysis would be also helpful for those who want to see the variety of Tolkien's poems in their own languages. The first and the second volumes of the History of Middle-earth, it is the Book of Lost Tales, were officially published in Russian in 2018, but they actually were translated from 1998 till 2002. The team of translators had to solve specific problems, and the translation of the poems was only one of them. In some cases, the original has different versions of a poem published in full form, and the translators translated all of them. You and Me and the Cottage of Lost Play was published in Russian, as well as The Little House of Lost Play. And all the 3 versions of The Trees of Cortirion have their Russian equivalents. Nevertheless, versions of particular lines, as you can see in the presentation, are omitted. You can see below that part of the original text is not represented in the Russian translation. The advantage of this, it is very easy for the translator to omit the part, but for the readers, they have to find the original volume for some scholar purposes, for example. The commentary to Tinfang Warble in Russian repeats the original one. In the earliest version, Tinfang is called Lepron, etc., while it is left unclear where to put that word in the Russian version. The English one has the rhyme, Fawn, Lawn. So we can find easily where to put Lepron into. A son of Ariador has the son called she, and in Russian the son has neutral gender. So the translator invented the form lady son for the Russian translation. Editorial words in the commentary, but it may be noted that the first word of the 3rd verse, she, is an emendation from he in both copies, were omitted in the translation. The team of the translators decided to omit some alternate readings in the second book too, but to note these omissions. The original poem, J.R.R. and Angela Bearcast, has the editorial footnote with readings of the earliest version, starting with the first 8 lines in full and continuing with specific phrases such as line 16, instead of streaming, there was evening, or line 22, instead of and the dusk.
Constantin?
Yes? Yes?
There's a box appearing on your screen, a yellow outlined with some text in red highlighted in black.
Now it has disappeared. Has it? Well.
Yep. Oh.
Well, I'm sorry, I cannot put the inscription away. I hope it will be you will be able to read the presentation without those annoying inscription. I have never seen such an inscription before.
By the looks of it, we should be okay.
So I'm sorry, you can see all the other text.
Please do continue.
Well, it's a technical problem.
Yeah, all the text is fine.
Everything in the text is clear, I suppose.
Yeah, everything is.
Well, instead of
clear. I just want to make you aware that it has.
I will continue. There was to the dusk. In Russian version, the translators reproduced only the first version of the first 8 lines and added their own editorial commentary. Here's the commentary. Further, in the original English notes, variants of phrasing of individual lines are given, which are almost impossible to convey in Russian due to the peculiarities of poetic translation. Editorial note. The next poem, The Shows of Fairy, has Christopher's commentary in the original. I give it here in the latest version, undateable, with all readings from the earliest in footnotes, which is reproduced in the Russian translation with the Russian editorial footnote, almost completely omitted in the translation. End of quotation. We can see the omissions of the most of versions in the translation of the Tale of Arundel in the presentation. You can see it in the below part of the pages. It was too difficult to translate the third volume of the History of Middle-earth because it consists mostly of verse. So the translators decided to translate the 4th volume before the 3rd one. It was translated in 2006 and published in 2020. The translators say in their foreword to the 4th volume, The Shaping of Middle-earth, the Quenta, the Ambar Canto, and the Annals. We deliberately give verse quotations given in prosaic texts, in particular in the comments to the sketch of the mythology and to Quenta, in a literal, line-by-line translation, since in the overwhelming majority of cases, Christopher Tolkien uses quotations in order to illustrate the coincidence of phrases and individual lines, the way of presenting the material as such in the text of different periods, tracing the evolution of the legendarium step by step. In such a context, fact is involved, not aesthetic information. It is the literalness of the formulations that is important, which, of course, a poetic translation essentially excludes. In Appendix 2 to Section 3, entirely devoted to the poem The Horns of Ylmer, the text of the poetic work as such, as well as quotations from early versions, is given in a poetic translation. Fragments of the Old English text, Appendix 1 to Section 3 and appendices to Sections 6 and 7, are given in a bilingual version by adding additional pages, e.g. 338a, 339a, etc., to translate the originals of Ariel or Elfwine into Russian, which allows to the reader who does not speak Old English to get in touch with the original itself, as well as familiarize himself with its content. The poem The Horns of Ylmer is also represented in the bilingual version by adding additional pages, 216a and 217a, thereby laying the foundation for the tradition of presenting poetic texts for subsequent volumes. We decided to take this step, undoubtedly controversial one, wishing to give the reader the opportunity to fully appreciate not only the quality of the poetic translation, albeit as close as possible to the original, but also the phonetic structure and the rhythm and the very unique sounding of the music of the original, which belongs to the unsurpassed masterpieces by J.R.R. Tolkien. So when there are not many poems in the volume, we can add some additional pages in which the original is represented, as well as the translation. But this approach does not fit to the third volume because it would be double in size when the original and the translation are presented one next to another. But it was only the fourth volume. And after the fourth volume, the fifth was translated too. The fifth volume, The Lost Sword and Other Writings, Language and Legend Before the Lord of the Rings, was translated in 2016 and published in 2021. The translators present a similar conception. We deliberately give poetic quotes cited in prosaic texts, in particular in the comments to Quenta Silmarillion, in a literal, line-by-line translations, despite the fact that we have a poetic version of the text, since Christopher Tolkien uses quotes in order to illustrate the coincidence of speech revolutions and individual lines in the texts of different periods. In such a context, it is important to repeat precisely the literalness of the formulations, which poetic translation essentially excludes. For example, in the commentary to Quenta Silmarillion, section 147, analyzing the episode of the death of the elven king Fingolfin at the gates of Angband, Christopher Tolkien compares the quotation from the Quenta section 9, volume 4, page 106. Orcs sing about this duel at the gates, with the corresponding lines of the Lay of Lathian, 3,584, 3,585. Yet orcs would after laughing tell of the duel at the gates of hell. Bringing the quotation in the Russian poetic translation literally, the orcs speak with laughter about the fight at the cursed gates, would not allow demonstrating the repetition of key words, tracing the sequential work on a specific episode. The original poems are printed in a different way. The additional pages are not put next to the pages with the translation. Instead, pages after 104, there is a section called The Original Poems, published on pages 87, 91, and 98 till 103 of the English edition. And there are additional pages with a numbered from 105 to 112 in square brackets. There are above the list. And after the numeration of the Russian pages from 105 continues. So, unlike the fourth volume, they decided to prepare a special section. And in that special section, the original of the poetic texts is presented. Well, the third volume, the hardest one to translate. The third volume, The Lays of Beleriand, was being translated into Russian for more than 2 decades, for more than 20 years. Because it is very hard to translate verse text. It was published in 2020. The translators write, establishing the tradition of presenting poetic texts for subsequent editions of this series. We present poetic fragments in a bilingual version, wishing to give the reader the opportunity to fully appreciate not only the quality of the poetic translation, as close as possible to the original, but also the phonetic structure and rhythm, and the very unique sound of the original. This inevitably increases the number of pages. In order to maintain the pagination of the original edition, published by J.R.R. and Unwin in 1985, we mark the pagination of the original with an indentation in the margins. Everywhere with a bilingual presentation of a literary text, poetic translation, the Russian version follows the first on the left. The English original follows the second on the right. The notes and commentaries also contain revised fragments of large poems, designed as separate poems, light as a leaf on linden tree, winter comes to Nargothrond, etc. Regardless of the section, such fragments are considered as independent works and are designed accordingly. In other cases, in the notes section, the first on the left is the commented text of the poetic passages. The second on the right is a literal interlinear translation. In the comment section, verse quotes are also deliberately given in a literal interlinear translation, as a rule without the original text, since in the context of Christopher Tolkien's comments, factual, not aesthetic information is involved, and it is the literal wording that is important. I suppose this kind of translation is the best because it represents the beauty of the original verse in the main form, as well as factual differences in versions in the prosaic form. Those who know English can compare the original versions as well as the Russian translations of them. The disadvantage of the approach is that many additional pages are required. The ideal translation would use verse form both in the main text and in its versions, but it is often impossible to capture all the nuances of the original poems.